Hi everyone, good afternoon, good Erev Shabbos. Hope you're doing well. We're going to do a quick Rashi this afternoon on Parshas Bo on the sixth Aliyah, which we're going to read this Shabbos. We've gotten to the point in the Parsha after all of the lead up and all of the preambles and all of the makos and all of the preparations and all of the instructions and Korban Pesach and the blood on the doorpost and everything that transpired in the lead up. We finally, in the sixth Aliyah, reached the actual moment of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the actual exodus from Egypt. Vayisu b'nei Israel, they travel, they leave, they actually go. They leave Egypt just as they had prepared to do. And then Torah tells us, V'yofu es habatzek asher hotzim miMitzrayim, ugos matzos kilo chametz ki gorshu miMitzrayim. Tells us the famous pasuk, which says that they couldn't bake their bread. They didn't have enough time to let their bread totally rise. Ki gorshu miMitzrayim, they were kicked out of Egypt. Everything happened with great haste. Multiple psukim here in our parsha describing the haste commanded by Hashem, the haste sort of perpetuated by the Egyptians who kicked them out, and so on and so forth. Ki gorshu miMitzrayim, they left so quickly. This is the story we tell our children. They left so fast that they didn't even have time to let their bread rise, and that's why we have matzah on Pesach. Beautiful. They couldn't wait around. They couldn't stick around. Once he said you can leave, they were ready to go. And then the pasuk appends a little statement at the end, which says, "Vegam tzeidah lo asu lahem." They might have made some kind of dough, which they then carried with them onto their journey. However, gam tzeidah lo asu lahem. They didn't make any tzeidah to bring with them. What is tzeidah? Tzeidah is provisions. So they may have brought this kind of food, which is dough, which would eventually rise or not rise. They would bake it into matzah, but they didn't seem to prepare any other foods for the journey. Gam tzeidah lo asu lahem. Rashi says, laderech. They didn't prepare any other provisions for the way. Why is the Torah telling us this? Not just from a practical perspective to tell us that because they went so quickly, they didn't have time, but to tell us something else as well. Magid Shavachan Shel Yisrael, to tell us the praises of the Jewish people. We've seen that phrase a few times already in the Rashis in this Parsha. Many things that Bnei Yisrael do here are being cited to sing their praises. For example, in preparations of the Korban Pesach, all the instructions, Rashi says that when the pasuk tells us that they did everything Moshe and Aaron had commanded them to do, the Torah was simply stating that lahagid shavachan shel Yisrael, to tell us the praise of the Jewish people, that they didn't deviate one iota from the instructions of Moshe and Aaron. It's telling us that they really got into this whole practice of mitzvahs, right? God gave them a lot of responsibilities, over 20-something mitzvahs just in this little passage here of what they're supposed to do in this very initial stage of their nationhood. They're not used to this. They're not used to a life of command. They're not used to all these details, but they did it really, really well. God sings their praises for that. He sings their praises for many things in this parsha. It shows the beautiful, loving relationship that was developing here between God and the Jewish people. God was ready to do for them. They were ready to do for him. And they recognized that. And therefore, there's constant psukim which are put into the parsha, lahagid shvachan shel Yisrael, to sing the praises. God recognizes the great job the Jewish people are doing in these nascent days of their nationhood. And one of those examples is here in our pasuk. Gam tzeidah lo asu lahem. They didn't make provisions. That's being told to us here specifically, lahagid shvachan shel Yisrael, to sing their praises. What is it praising them for? Shelo amru. They didn't say, hechne tzei lamidbar belo tzeidah, ela ha'eminu v'halchu. God says to them, leave, go. He tells them to do a lot of preparation in terms of the Korban Pesach, what they had to eat on that night, what they had to do on that night, but it doesn't give them any instructions for what to take with them along the journey. And instead of saying, well, God, really? You're taking us out? Where are you going to take us? How are you going to take us? How's it going to work out? How are we going to have food? Constantly questioning his plan and his motivations and how it would all come to fruition. They had faith. Perhaps you could call it blind faith. Maybe there's times when blind faith is not great, but there are times when blind faith is called for and blind faith is appropriate. And this is one of those moments. They didn't question God's plan at all. Any normal human being would say, well, what about food? We got to prepare something. We have some snacks for the road. They didn't say that. They said, we're going, period. Gam tzeidah lo asu lahem. They didn't even prepare provisions. They didn't say, hechne tzei lamidbar belo tzeidah. How are we going to go out without a snack, without provisions, without preparations, without food? No, ha'eminu v'halchu. They believed and they went. This concept, which is only being stated here as a veiled reference, is more explicitly mentioned, as Rashi points out, in the Navi Yirmiyahu. Hu mefurish b'Kabbalah. There's a Kabbalah. It doesn't mean Kabbalah like a Kabbalistic thought like the Arizal or the Zohar. It's talking about Kabbalah, the Masorah, the tradition that we receive from the prophets is as follows. Yirmiyahu says, in describing this period of Jewish history, Zacharti la chesed ne'urayich, lechtech acharai b'midbar be'eretz lo zerua. The second parak of the Navi Yirmiyahu looks back upon the better days in the relationship between God and the Jewish people. Yirmiyahu was facing bad days. Jewish people were rebelling against God. They weren't deserving of God's compassion. But Yirmiyahu says, remember way back when we first left Egypt, I'm remembering chesed ne'urayich, the kindness of your youth. Avas kulosayich, the love of your nuptials, the original days when we were getting married and developing our relationship. What was the prime example of the love that Bnei Yisrael showed for Hashem? Lechtech acharai b'midbar be'eretz lo zerua, that you followed me out into a desert, to a place that was desolate, to a place that was unseeded. There was no provisions, there was no food, there were no crops, and yet you followed them out. Yirmiyahu describes Gam Tzeidah Lo Asu Lahem. He describes the emunah, the faith that they had to follow God out into the desert. Maschar mefurash acharav. And the next pasuk in Yirmiyahu says that they reached a very high level because of that. Kadosh Yisrael Hashem. They became holy to God. It greatly intensified their emunah, and that greatly intensified emunah enhanced their relationship with God and solidified it forever. So this is a very, very important display of faith. They had other displays of faith in our parsha. The fact that they took the Korban Pesach, the god of Egypt, and they shechted it, they put blood on the doorpost, these were all acts of faith, perhaps blind faith in God, not knowing how they would turn out. But as they transitioned from slavery to freedom, this is perhaps one of the greatest displays of their faith, Gam Tzeidah Lo Asu Lahem. It's highlighted by the fact that if you go forward in Jewish history, to Sefer Yehoshua, when they're crossing into Israel, they're finally reaching the end of this journey. The Navi specifically tells us when they're crossing the Yarden, they prepared Tzeidah. They prepared provisions for their journey. And that's not a slight on Bnei Yisrael in the time of Yehoshua, but it's a contrast. And the contrast is so jarring. Once they reach the point in Israel, they're reaching a natural life. They're going into Israel. They have to learn how to prepare. They have to prepare their own food. The transition from desert life to life in Israel was a transition from the miraculous to the natural. So they had to prepare over there. But this, the beginning of the journey, the exodus from Egypt, was a moment of total dependence on God, like an infant depends upon a parent. And in that moment of total infancy, it wasn't about us thinking we could prepare, we could have provisions. It's about us simply relying on God. That contrast shows the difference between Bnei Yisrael at the original stage and at the later stage, 40 years later, the miraculous life versus the natural life. In this moment of miraculous life, all we had to do was have faith, and we did. To sing the praises of the Jewish people for having that kind of faith in this moment of Exodus. May we all be zocheh to reach such levels of faith. We don't have open miracles, but hopefully we can develop that faith within ourselves as well. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom. Take care, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. Thank you very much.